In the financial world, when an institution issues a third warning within a single cycle, it doesn't signal routine turbulence. It signals a deeper systemic problem. That's where we are right now. Representative Sherry Tanador of Michigan has filed a fresh set of impeachment articles against former President Donald Trump. This isn't just another political skirmish or replay of past chapters. This move targets the very foundation of executive restraint, the cornerstone of any functioning democracy. And as I often tell investors, when confidence in oversight weakens, it's not just politics that shake, it's the entire market structure that begins to tremble. This impeachment push isn't about partisanship, it's about risk, constitutional, institutional, and ultimately financial, because power unchecked isn't efficient, it's expensive. The cost of institutional fragility can't be hedged, and when that fragility compounds, it erodes the invisible currency of every economy, trust. Tanador argues that Trump's actions, from unauthorized deportations to arbitrary tariff strategies and the hollowing out of key regulatory bodies, represent an abuse of authority that corrodes governance. When leaders distort rules meant for fairness, investors no longer adjust for earnings or interest rates. They adjust for national credibility. The reality is simple. Credibility compounds just like interest, and once it erodes, it never returns at full value. We're seeing that unfold before our eyes. Over the last few days, the situation in Washington has evolved from speculation to systemic stress. Articles of impeachment were filed on October 11th and 12th, and while Democrats hold a minority in the House, the symbolic and constitutional weight of this move far outweighs the arithmetic of votes. This isn't just another political statement. It's a structural signal, a reflection of a government testing its own capacity for self-correction. But this time, it's not only Congress applying pressure. Behind closed doors, reports suggest that senior members of Trump's own cabinet are quietly exploring the 25th Amendment. That clause, buried deep within the Constitution, allows the transfer of presidential power if the president is deemed unable to fulfill their duties. You only hear whispers of the 25th when the system senses internal fracture. I've seen corporate boards discuss leadership transitions under stress. It never begins with open revolt. It starts with quiet contingency planning when insiders realize that waiting has become riskier than acting. That's the situation now. Impeachment proceedings from Congress intersecting with internal cabinet deliberations about invoking constitutional succession. It's unprecedented. Imagine a corporation where the board faces a shareholder lawsuit and simultaneously considers removing the CEO. You don't reach that point unless confidence has evaporated. When leadership loses alignment, the question shifts from whether change is possible to whether survival now depends on it. This isn't theater. It's a stress test for the American Republic, and the results will define how future leaders interpret limits on executive power. For years, Trump's behavior has raised red flags, but the new impeachment filings introduce entirely new legal arguments. These aren't recycled allegations from Ukraine or January 6th. They're rooted in recent executive actions that scholars warn could violate constitutional boundaries. Two specific incidents triggered this escalation. The first, an executive order declaring Antifa a terrorist organization without meeting statutory requirements. Regardless of personal opinions about the group, that power rests with the State Department after interagency review and congressional oversight. Bypassing that process wasn't just irregular, it was illegal under existing frameworks. The second, reports that a federal prosecutor, Eric Burt, was pressured to resign after refusing to pursue investigations into political adversaries. That's not a personnel dispute, that's a red line. When legal enforcement becomes a political tool, legitimacy dissolves. In markets, when compliance officers are punished for doing their jobs, you don't question policy, you question survival. The same principle applies here. When a president fires or pressures prosecutors for refusing unlawful orders, the structure of justice becomes vulnerable. You can't rebuild that easily. Once trust and neutrality breaks, it triggers long-term instability that outlives the crisis. Meanwhile, reports suggest the Justice Department held emergency meetings after these incidents surfaced. Inside those walls, cabinet officials reportedly began discussing the 25th Amendment again, not as rumor, but as a last resort measure to preserve continuity. This amendment, ratified in 1967, was designed to ensure the nation never faced a leadership vacuum, but it has never been invoked against a sitting president who refuses to step down. To use it now would mark the first involuntary transfer of power in American history. The decision to even consider it suggests profound internal alarm. Cabinet officials and senior advisors, people sworn to protect the Constitution, are now assessing whether the executive branch can function under its current leadership. That's not opposition. That's institutional fear. And fear of this kind spreads quickly, not just through Washington, but through global markets that rely on American stability as an anchor. For Democrats, this is a moment of calculation. Timing matters. Every impeachment carries political risk. Move too early and you strengthen your opponent. Wait too long and you lose moral credibility. But according to legal groups like Free Speech for People, over 24 justifications for impeachment now exist, a number that's growing. The concern has evolved from politics into preservation. When systemic violations become patterns, accountability becomes less a choice and more a constitutional obligation. Across the legal community, conservative and liberal scholars alike are converging on one truth: the rules of governance are under stress. And when both sides of the intellectual spectrum raise alarm, it's not about optics anymore, it's about precedent. The moment a democracy normalizes unlawful authority, it forfeits the safeguards that protect its future. If impeachment proceeds, the process will be slow and visible. The House may move forward with hearings, public testimony, and procedural votes. But the Senate remains the gatekeeper. Conviction requires a 2/3 majority, a threshold nearly impossible in today's divided environment. Yet even without conviction, the act of impeachment carries enormous weight. It documents behavior, it sets historical boundaries, and history doesn't forget. If Trump were impeached again, he'd become the first president in U.S. history to face that measure 3 times. That alone shifts the constitutional narrative forever. It signals to future leaders that no one, not even a former president, operates beyond scrutiny. In governance, precedent is power. Each impeachment, successful or not, redefines the perimeter of accountability. Meanwhile, talk of the 25th Amendment lingers in the background, not as gossip, but as a real contingency. Unlike impeachment, which requires weeks of debate, The 25th operates immediately. If invoked, power transfers to the vice president at once. Trump could contest it, but he'd remain out of power during the review. That's a legal design meant for continuity, but politically it's a shock wave. It would redefine loyalty and ignite chaos across the party structure. Yet invoking it carries its own danger. Use the 25th for political ends, and you risk weaponizing the Constitution. Once that happens, future leaders may use it as leverage rather than safeguard. Every president would then govern under the threat of internal overthrow. That's not oversight. That's instability. The line between emergency action and political convenience must remain sacred. Once blurred, the cost of restoring balance becomes nearly infinite. The deeper issue here isn't just Trump or the Democrats. It's the fragility of the system itself. When checks and balances falter, when branches of government begin acting out of self-defense rather than principle, democracy enters a danger zone. It becomes reactionary, brittle, expensive, and unpredictability seeps into every layer of national life. As someone who has watched institutions rise and fall, I'll tell you this. Structural decline never begins with explosions. It begins with silence, normalization, and the belief that the rules can bend just this once. When that belief spreads, you don't have stability, you have entropy. The next few weeks will define more than headlines. They'll determine whether institutional courage still exists. Lawmakers, cabinet officials, and judges will have to decide whether their loyalty lies with individuals or with the Constitution. Those choices, made under pressure and public glare, will shape not only history books, but the culture of accountability for generations. The cost of action may be steep, but the cost of inaction, of normalizing disregard for the law, could be catastrophic. Because when a democracy stops enforcing its boundaries, it doesn't collapse all at once. It simply forgets how to stand upright. Markets understand that uncertainty is poison. Governance should understand the same. Every investor knows ambiguity erodes confidence, and confidence is everything. In the coming days, we'll see resignations, leaks, statements, and silence, all signals in a system struggling to correct itself. Watch carefully, not for noise, but for behavior, because in both finance and governance, fundamentals always reveal the truth. At its core, this isn't about one man or one impeachment. It's about whether the American system can still regulate itself under stress, whether the antibodies of democracy, oversight, legal consequence, institutional integrity still function when tested. The outcome will define not just this presidency, but the meaning of constitutional accountability itself. And as I've always said, when credibility compounds, societies grow stronger. When it decays, everything else follows. That's why this moment matters, not as politics, but as a measure of national character. We're not observers in this. We're all investors in the same institution. Trust. And what happens next will determine whether it pays dividends or defaults for generations to come.